And before we get started today, I want to preempt it with a little bit of a, what do I call it? Not a story, but with an example, an idea, if you will, as we go into this, because it's important that we understand the Bible correctly, right? I think that's very, very important. The reason I say this is because certainly in Christian culture today, in church culture and whatnot, certainly in our world culture, there's this real adverse reaction to fear. That fear is actually this terrible, horrible thing. In fact, I remember, especially when I was coming up, probably, in high school into early college and stuff, there was like that really big thing where it was like, oh, there's two sides of a spectrum. It's either fear or love. Do you guys remember that? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? No? Okay, well, whatever. The reason I remember is because if you go around, you could probably meet a lot of 30-year-old women who have fear on one wrist and love on the other wrist, okay? It was like a really big thing at the time. And because it was like the idea was, oh, you have two choices. You can either choose to be afraid or you can choose to embrace love. And I think that's a terrible, terrible idea. Why? Because fear is actually a very strong motivator that can often be driven by a loving God, for example. In fact, one of the best examples I could think of as I was preparing this message and as I was going through this, is think about being a child. You're a young child, and your mom looks at you and says, "Just wait until your father gets home." There's a fear that begins to overwhelm you, right? Or we're in a small town, right? Someone in this town says, "I know your mother. I'm going to tell her what you just did." Right? There's a fear in there. Now, is it because you're afraid of your violent parent that's going to destroy your business? No, because you know that what you did is wrong, and that and you know what it is that you deserve. And you're afraid of the consequences, and you're afraid, why? Because you know that your parents are right to do what they're doing. The same thing goes with God. We need to have a proper fear of God. We need to hold God in the proper esteem, right? I've been bringing this up time and time again for the last little while. Does God hold the proper place in your life? Because if he does, there should be a bit of fear in your heart. Let me tell you, the greatest single motivating factor I've had to not introduce sin or transgression in my life has been the fear of God and what I'm going to have to fess up to when one day I got to stand before him. Right? I know I'm saved by grace. Can you imagine how horrible it is, right, when you stand before a parent and there you go, "I'm disappointed." How much worse is that going to be when it's God looking at you and being like, "Come on, you knew better. That is disappointing." Like it's going to be so much worse, right? Even if you are saved, you want to be a Christian, you want to be a believer that is doing the things that bring joy to God's heart. Isn't that our desire as Christians? We want to be doing those things. So fear ought to be a good and proper motivation technique or a motivational tool. It is not. Fear and love aren't on opposite ends of the spectrum. In fact, very often, because of love, fear can drive us to do things. Why do I say all this? Let's get into 1 Samuel chapter 6, where we're going to talk about fear today. When the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory for 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place." Now, two things here. For those of you who don't know, God showed up in 1 Samuel chapter 5. He showed up and he showed them, "I don't need anybody. I am the I am. I am sovereign. I am God. I will do what I will do. And I don't need anyone to do it for me." Okay? He just showed up. First he made their God bow to them, and then he began to bring plagues upon the Philistines. And it says they endured it for 7 months. For 7 months, the ark of God traveled around the Gaza Strip from city to city, where they kept enduring the torment that would follow it as they went. But finally, finally, they grew to a point where the people said, enough is enough. We're done with this. We can't deal with it anymore. And so they said, what do we need to do? How do we need to get rid of this? Why? Because they had grown afraid. Right? If you were with us in chapter 5, this was very clear and evident. But in chapter 6, we know that this is a response to what was just happening. And it says, they answered, if you return the ark of God to Israel, right? This is the diviners and the priest of Dagon, not, of course, the priest of God. They said, if you return the ark of God to Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means, send a guilt offering to him. Then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has been lifted from you. It's interesting that these priests immediately recognize the guilt of the nation. Right? He doesn't say, do it so that it would be good and pleasing. Do it so that you might earn God's favor and therefore he will become your God. He says, do it because you know you are guilty. You know that what you have done is wrong. You know that you have sinned. It's interesting that it was coming from priests who didn't even serve God. They recognized his authority. They recognized his power. The Philistines asked, what guilt offering should we send to him? That's a good question. And a very natural one, isn't it? In fact, it's so natural that even certain church institutions have instituted this very thing because we come before God, we stand guilty, we stand accused, and we go, God, what can I do in order to earn your favor on me again? Now, of course, as Christians, we know there isn't anything, right? Jesus died on the cross. He has taken care of that for us. But that guilt still weighs heavy on our hearts, doesn't it? Whenever we violate the Lord's law, whenever we violate the Lord's will and we act against him, if we have a true reconciliation with God, there is a guilt, there is a heaviness in our heart where we say, I know I wronged God and I feel awful about it. And we want to do something, we want to fix it. We want to be able to go out and do it, and so there are certain institutions that have done this, and so I can understand what they're feeling right here. They're saying, we need to do something. We have to actually do something in order to please this God. So they replied, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of Philistine rulers. Remember, there was the 5 cities, and we'll go over their names here in a little bit. And so each city had a ruler, so there was 5 kings. And it says, because the same plague has struck both you and your rulers, make models of the tumors and of the rats that are destroying this country, and give glory to Israel's God. How interesting. Did they worship the God of Israel? Absolutely not. They didn't worship Yahweh. And yet, through their fear, through what was happening, through the plagues and the destruction that was happening in Philistia, they began to recognize this is the God that is worthy of glory. And how did he do it? Why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When Israel's God dealt harshly with them, did they not send the Israelites out so they could go on their way? Many people have said, why did God deal so harshly with Egypt to the point where God hardened Pharaoh's heart? And to that I say, for this very reason, that the word spread throughout the entire world, that God is sovereign, he is Lord of all. And even the Philistines who came in much later to the picture heard the story, knew the tale about what had happened to a nation who thought themselves the leaders of gods, who lived amongst gods. They thought themselves equal with God, and yet God brought them low. How awesome is that? So now they prepare for them the test. I call it the test. So they say, now then, get a new cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take the calves away and pen them up. And then take the ark of the Lord and put it on a cart, and in a chest beside it put gold objects that you are sending back to him as a guilt offering, and send it on its way. But keep watching. If it goes up into its own territory towards Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened by chance. So why this test? That should be a question. Wait, why this test? Now, in an agrarian population, we wouldn't have to explain this test. But not many of us here are farmers, okay? We haven't worked on farms and stuff. One of the things that I actually had the privilege of working with a lot was actually dairy cows as a kid. I worked a lot on dairy farms, and this one always really stuck out to me. I love this story because I understood what they were trying to do here. See, what happens is when a cow first gives birth, when a cow calves, and it has this newborn calf, that calf is super reliant on the mother, not only for nutrition, but also for protection. The world is dangerous out there, and you need a great big cow to defend you if you're a tiny little calf. And so the mother actually has this built-in instinct that she will call out and protect her calf. It's strange. It's not super common in a lot of species on our planet, but certainly in mammals we see it, where there's this mammalian instinct to want to protect our young. Right? You see it in a whole bunch of different mammals, but certainly you see it in cows, which are herd animals. They want to protect their young. And so they will, and we're going to read about this here in a moment, where it says they were lowing, and we'll talk about that. And said so they figured, wait a minute, if we separate the cows from the calves, that's going to make this challenge all the more difficult, right? This reminds me a lot of the test to see if a woman was caught in adultery. Do you remember that one? They would take dust off the floor and put it in a cup, and then you'd have to drink the water mixed with dust. Now, for the most part, you're going to be fine. It's a little dust. Nothing's going to hurt you. But it says the Lord will, take hold of that, and if she was an adulteress, it'll kill her. Or no, it didn't kill her. It made her barren, and it did something else. I can't remember what it was. But it made her quite ill, right? Whereas, really, the more natural response would be she would be fine. So in this case, they're figuring, wait a minute, let's really ramp up the difficulty, because if we just send cows away, they'll just wander off. But if we use mother cows who are looking for their young, that's going to take some real motivation in order to make them go. So they did it. Verse 10, and they took 2 such cows, and they hitched them to the cart, and they penned up their calves, so the calves can't follow. And then they placed the ark of the Lord in the cart along with the chest containing the gold rats and the models of the tumors. And the cows went straight up. I love this. They went straight up towards Beth Shemesh, keeping on the road, lowing all the way, and they did not turn to the right or the left. Now, why do cows low? Mother cows low because they're trying to call their calf. They're saying, "Here I am, where are you?" And they're calling and calling and calling. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever worked with cows. Cows are not exactly the most motivated animals, okay? They're quite difficult to get doing what you want them to do. And one of the things that cows definitely like to do is meander and wander, okay? They do not like to be driven in a straight line. This cart had no driver. This is an important detail. There was no one sitting on the back of this cart telling the cows to get going up to Beth Shemesh. And yet, for some reason, some miracle, this cart acted like it had a driver and drove the cows to go against their will. Remember, they're lowing, they're calling their calves. They'd rather go back to their calves. But they went against their will all the way back to Israel. And it says they didn't turn left or right. I thought that was interesting because it didn't even say in their test, they were just like, look, if he even makes it there, that's good enough. But this is saying, no, they made a beeline on the road, perfect execution, directly to Beth Shemesh. That's incredible. And I think that's exactly why they outlined this test the way they did. They said, this should not happen. If this is natural, if this is normal, if this is not their God, then, we'll maintain control of the ark. But if not, well, we see what we end up seeing. God drove the cattle along the way. It proved to the Philistines that God was, in fact, in control. And now the people of Beth Shemesh were harvesting their wheat in the valley. If you remember, they went out to fight in the springtime. That was often when the wars would happen between leaders. They would often fight in the spring and the spring and into summer. And then, of course, everyone had to go home and harvest, so no one had any time to fight back then. So now we see we're in the fall. They were getting ready to harvest their wheat in the valley, and when they looked up, they saw the ark, and they rejoiced at the sight. The cart came into the field of Joshua at Beth Shemesh, and there it stopped beside a large rock. The people chopped up the wood of the cart and sacrificed the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. Man, they're starting off right. Immediately, they're recognizing the power of God, what God has done, and they're saying, thank you, God, and they want to give him a sacrifice immediately. Sounds good, right? Except for this is the same people that 7 months ago, remember, thought that they could manipulate God and make him do what they wanted to do. So we're going to see something else happen here as well. So the Levites took the ark of the Lord together with the chest containing the gold objects, and they placed them on the large rock. And on that day, the people of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and made sacrifices to the Lord. Seems good. Then the 5 rulers of the Philistines saw all this, and they returned that same day to Ekron. Right? They were satisfied. They said, clearly, the Lord is in control. These are the gold tumors that the Philistines sent as a guilt offering to the Lord, one each for Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. The number of gold brats was according to the number of Philistine towns belonging to the 5 rulers, the fortified towns, and their country villages. And so the large rock on which the Levites set the ark of the Lord is a witness to this day in the field of Joshua in Beth Shemesh. And then we get to verse 19. Remember, these are people who do not properly fear the Lord, right? What drove the Philistines to finally do what they did? It was they finally recognized who God was, his authority, his power, and they feared his wrath and said, we need to send him on his way because we have done wrong, we are guilty. But these Israelites still haven't figured this out, right? They already made a mistake and lost the ark 7 months ago. But now verse 19, it says, but God struck down some of the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. Why? He put 70 of them to death because they looked into the ark of the Lord. And the people mourned because of the heavy blow that the Lord had dealt them. And no, it wasn't like Raiders of the Lost Ark. They probably just fell over dead. They didn't melt like the faces of Nazis. Thank you, one person who got that. And the people of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in the presence of this holy God? See, that was the thing. They had forgotten. They had forgotten the power of God. And I think this is a big issue that the church has today. We forget the power of God. We have this idea, and it is a right idea, that we have this relationship with God. We have this closeness with God. And we do, and it's important. And just like our Father, right, as we were growing up as children, and we could look at our Father, and we would see someone who was loving and who cared for us and wanted the very best for us, right? I look back on my time growing up, and I think, yeah, there were certainly times I was afraid of my dad, but that's because, guess what? I did something wrong, not because of him. Here's the thing. When we're children, we can very clearly kind of put the hierarchy in order of people of importance in our lives, right? We understand that our parents are above us as children. But so very often as we grow up into adults, we make the mistake of thinking we're like on par with God. And maybe you'll say with your mouth, oh no, that's nonsense. But in our actions, we act completely different. Sometimes we act like we're superior to God. And that is a problem because we're not. Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? That should be our question. And by the way, isn't that our great privilege that we can come into church and stand in his presence? As we come up to Thanksgiving, that should well our hearts up with gratitude and thankfulness that we can stand in the presence of our holy God. So then they sent messengers to the people of Kiriath Jearim, saying, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your town. So what do we do with all this information? I think there's 2 things. There was 2 big things that I thought that I was thinking of. Number one, well, we talked about fear, but number one, I think that God directs nature. This is a very big deal. Right? We see how God directs the cows and what he does. And the reason I want to bring up God directs nature is because it seems fairly obvious to anyone that's been paying attention, but the idea of a pagan Gaia worship has been on the rise significantly over the last 50, 60 years. People have just begun to worship the earth as if she is a force upon herself instead of recognizing that they are worshiping a creation of the Creator. They don't recognize the power of God, and we don't recognize his ability, that God is the one that is in control. Which leads me to number 2, that God is sovereign over all. Again, I brought this up at the very beginning, and I told you I was going to link up to it, and here it is. What place does God hold in your life? Why did you come here this morning? I want to ask you to reflect on that because, again, with our mouth, it's very easy to say, yes, Jesus is Lord. Hallelujah. That is the truth. And good. And I'm glad that you can confess it with your mouth. But does your life line up with that statement? Is it obvious to your family and friends, to your coworkers, to everyone around you that God holds that place in your life? See, I hear Christians talk about it all the time, how they're ready, they're willing, able to serve God, and they want to do great things for God. But do you? Do you serve God? This isn't me casting judgment. This is me asking. So for anyone feeling guilty, I always say that's conviction, not me. I have no idea. I don't know what happens in the private areas of your lives, and I don't know what you're doing. And I pray to God that each and every one of you is serving and doing great things, but I don't know. All I know is the calling I have on my life. And I want to make sure, as a pastor, that each and every one of you knows what's being asked of you and what's required. See, we have the honor of living at the time that we do. Right? Think about all of human history, all that we know, how difficult and challenging and so very hard life was. As big as of the issues that we make of today, right? Life has never been easier than it is right now. There's so much convenience. There's so much ease in life. There's so much advancement. It's made our lives so much easier. However, it's also made them incredibly distracting. And it can distract us away from our true purpose or of who God is. Things like sports and television, video games, politics, protests, news cycles, hobbies, careers, social status. In a word, materialism. We're much more concerned with the material world, the things around us that we can see, instead of the thing that sits above us. Instead of God, the creator of all things. We forget our Father. And unfortunately, we forget fear. Fear, which is the driving motivator that, as I said before, there are times when I am tempted to sin, believe it or not, it happens. And the biggest motivator I have to not sin is fear of God. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear is what drove the Philistines to send the ark of God back to Israel. Not only to send it back, but to offer up a guilt offering, to admit their guilt and their wrongdoing. Fear of God is eventually what's going to allow David to become the great king that we remember in history. To quote a prominent scientist who does not share my belief at all in God, when asked a question about the great concerns that he has in our future is, are we smart enough to be proper shepherds of our own fate? Sometimes I question whether we are wise enough. I'll give you my answer. We're not. We're hopelessly childish compared to God. We need the wisdom of God. We need His guidance. We need His direction. It's more than just a request. It's more than just a referral. It is an absolute dire need. God does not need us, as we talked about last week. But guess what? We need Him. Those things fall apart. I mean, look at what's happened. We took one of the most prosperous, we took the West, a time built on Christian values, where we honored God, we feared God properly. Most people believed and submitted and served God, and yet in only a few generations, we were able to turn that on its head. And suddenly we have some of the most hedonistic, materialist, awful things happening in our world today. As Christians, we know the answer to wisdom. But we need to get to the business of doing His business. To be serious Christians. This doesn't mean that we're all preachers. But it means that it should be obvious that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior in your life. That whenever people interact with you, when they talk to you, they should know, wait a minute, this Christian thing, you take it really seriously. Let me tell you, I don't know how many family dinners of my extended family we've had to deny because they say, no, we have church, we have this, and I'm like, no, we're not going to skip it. Why? Because this is the most important thing to me. Right? From the entertainment we consume as well, to the conversations we have, and the commitments that we make to such things like church. Let's not be like the Israelites, but instead stand for God. I want to leave you one last thing before I close off this. That's something that my dad taught me. My dad's not a Christian. But when I was growing up as a kid, and we'd be on the baseball team, for example. And what if I didn't feel like going that day? Didn't matter. Dad said, no, you have a duty and a responsibility to those that you committed to. You need to be there. My friends, I want to suggest to you today that same thing. You have a duty and a responsibility to God and His church. To be there for them. To help them, love them. And I want to be honest, I see a lot of good things that happen in the church. I see a lot of that goodness. I see those things, and I think, man, am I ever glad to be here in Kobe. But how much more could we do if we make sure we keep focused on that day after day after day? Because let me tell you, I'm just as prone to the distraction as anybody else. There's so much of it. So part of that duty to each other, let's keep each other on mission. Help remind each other when we're getting distracted or we start pulling off and going off the other way. Let's keep each other focused. Help each other out. And let each other know, hey, let's not be like the Israelites who forgot the fear of God. Ironically, let's be like the Philistines who maintained that fear and did the right thing.